Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 1.49 to 1.52, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 1.49, Vellum and Salt. It was with trembling hands that Valdeclaith packaged up 3 books of twine and prepared to descend. Nolan was manning the cafe and planning his conquest of the tower. Keith was scuttling back to his workshop to brew more of his patent elixir and sulk that Volda wouldn't let him serve it undiluted. There was a silence in the little bookshop. For the first time, Volda would be descending alone, even knowing there was a trapdoor where the damned thing was almost impossible to find. In the end, he had to scrape his knife along the edges and pry it open, his hands trembling. Look, if you don't stop, I'm going to cut a finger off. That'll show you who's boss. Volda threatened his own hand, a manic edge to his own voice as he lifted the knife in mock menace. Mad, a little voice in the corner of his mind noted, cracked under the strain, talks to his own fingers now. Oh, shush you. Levering up the trapdoor, he slid himself down into the dark with only a lantern to guide. The lantern that immediately went out with a rush of air that rose up the open tunnel, like a cold breath. Crap. A light shined in the darkness. It was, of all things, a rat. She glowed like she was made of moon dust, a quick silver apparition that lifted slowly and fading streaks of light behind as she moved. She squeaked at him, setting the lantern aside. Walter followed. Rats everywhere, living in Colton, had accustomed him to seeing them in just about every corner. But here, they seemed to have their own small city. The ratty noses and ratty faces poked out of the little burrows in the walls. Several squeaked at him, and others reached out, snagging his clothes with little paws and happily climbing aboard. Volda emerged from the tunnel covered in rats. They snuffled in his ears, making him laugh. It was surprisingly a cheerful thing. He moved to take a step forward. The moon rat squeaked at him, a very stern squeak. He drew his foot back, no need to find out what kind of death that he'd almost stepped in. Letting the rat guide him, he moved in a zigzag path through the dungeon. It was as strange and terrifying as the day he'd arrived. The ceiling arched up overhead, rough stones, dripping waters, mushrooms, the size of his fist grew on the black earth, their skin and translucent and delicate as glass. Glowing from within the different shades of light, several times Volda almost reached out to touch one, before a squeak or a claw of his own face brought him back to attention. Golden dust trickled down from above, and it came from the mushrooms in the shape of an amber bulbs that hung from the ceiling, drooling with a fine layer of spore that settled over everything, making the garden sparkle as if they were a treasure trove. Glass flowers sprouted from the earth, displaying bladed fans of petals that nicked his skin as he passed. Serpents coiled amidst the green moss, their organs on the beating display under the translucent skin. Giant mantises that were as tall as his knee perched, their claws lifted, waiting for prey to mistake them for the branches as their stillness and wonder to their waiting clutches. Still pools dotted with garden-like mirrors, and everything was getting bigger. No, Volda was shrinking away, the mushrooms looming up and his legs shortened, the beasts of the garden gaining on him. Crap! The rats spread up, and Volda hurried to keep pace, although his stride was shortening every second. As soon as the mushrooms were the size of his head, the snakes higher than he was when they reared up, his guide was the size of a dog. He couldn't have been more than 1.5 feet tall. Ahead, a gazebo made of frosted glass loomed, the size of a mountain. Every inch of it glittered, and Volda reached the door, hauling his way laboriously up the 3 giant steps. And he found there was a second door, inset within the first, just his size. He stepped through it and, like it was all the trick of perspective, was back to normal height in 3 steps. Most peculiar, he mumbled, out of breath and panting hard. Above him, a ripple ran through the air, frosted onto the glass, and words of condensing frost was a question. What have you brought me? Miriam's Guide to Spellwork, the treasure of earth and treatise of an element, and doesn't have a name, but it's very good. He sputtered out, clutching his knees as he tried to regain his breath. Sit, read to me. Walter hadn't expected that. He had hoped to drop off the books, give a brief report of the cafe's success, and leave. Instead, he found himself looking around for a seat. One neatly rose up out of the glass floor, waiting for him. It was a strange sort of room, with tools scattered across all 3 small workbenches, lit by crystal lamps. The center of the chamber was taken up by a single long table, bearing a dozen copies of the same cup. A beautiful thing in gold and red, the octagonal door sat in the middle of the ceiling. Very strange. The scholar sat awkwardly amongst all of this, cracking open the nameless leather-bound book. The world is governed by invisible powers, flows and ley lines of magic that no mortal can see. They run through the earth and sky. When these rivers of mana touch upon certain rare materials receptive to magic, such as a vein of gemstone or a long-buried star metal, a change of form may occur. A shiver ran through the air, making Volda look up. New words had appeared on the glass. Skip forward to how to kill them. He flipped through the pages, eyes splitting on the words quickly, desperately looking for... It doesn't say, he admitted, but I do see a section on binding them. Painfully. I can't imagine that they would like it, Volda replied. That'll do. To bind an elemental, shackles of a dark iron are needed. These sever the connection between the mana reservoir and grants them an unmatched power. Next, a spike is driven into the creature, bearing runes and binding on service, and the mage begins the process. He winced. The whole spell is in runic, which I've never learned. Mage diagrams and star stuff. Flipping through the pages, his eyes lit up. Aha! The taming of wild elementals has been managed by providing them with a larger source of mana than the reservoir they spawned them, slowly making them more pliable and pleasant towards their master, and even obedient. They have to pay. He paused. Oh, I just thought since you were a dungeon, with so much mana you could... His throat suddenly turned to iron, refusing to let another syllable escape. Apparently, he'd annoyed his host. Walter silently mouthed an apology as his lungs began to burn. They are my enemies. I do not forgive. Walter nodded frantically until the contract binding in his throat released him. I see, he gasped out. Read the one on the spellwork next. Massaging his neck, Walter reached down and picked up the next book. By the time the scholar left, he'd learned dozens of important things. One was an elemental set of runes, outlined in the book, that formed the basis of a more complex spellwork. Light, strength, siphon, grant. Together these were the workings of a simple light spell. It worked by drinking up the ambient mana and pushing it into a small wisp of ghostly flame. I tried twisting my mana into the required letters, to no avail. The chain of the spellwork I produced collapsed in on itself, creating instead a brief knotting in my ambient mana. I grimaced as I did my best to untie things before they condensed further and created some mutant abomination. So it seemed that doing human spellcraft was beyond me. It made sense. They practiced magic from the outside, reaching their hands into the realm of the arcane to pull out wonders. I was made of mana, and my every action was fundamentally magic. Different methods would be needed. Still, the runes themselves were deeply useful. I began to work on a spare opal, infusing it with mana and slowly shaping the familiar form of a shard. This time, I used my new vocabulary instead of blindly copying runes from my attunements. What resulted was a sign of how far I had come in just 1 month. Fair Shard of Strength. The basic shard grants the increase in physical prowess, blessing the bearer with the ability to surge forth with strength for a brief time and a telepathic connection to the dungeon core that created it. Now, I began to work on a golem to house it. I would need stronger, tougher creations to successfully conquer the stone hounds. The creature I crafted borrowed from its rhino and the marquise that had sent through the portal to attack me. An enormous, hulking body with a horned head meant for charging. This one was made of pure salt, and my aesthetic touches were limited to giving it a cloudy white skin and a horn that gleamed with tons of blood red. The result was pleasant in a rough way, its every motion and aspect displaying the concept of crude strength. I would have time to boil plenty more, while I waited for Volda to return. This time I sent him out into the world bearing the knuckle-bone pendant Sufi had left with me, as a sign that he was my messenger, and a request for her, 4 shackles of dark iron and a spike carved with runes for binding an elemental. End of chapter. Chapter 1.50 The Free Men. The sourness of burning hair, the crackling ash settling, these were the impressions the ruined village left on Kobachan. A dozen or more horsemen encircled him, their mounts stomping and snorting with fear as they were forced to approach the Arachne. Swords were pointed his way, questions shouted, and Kobachan could barely tell their faces apart. To him, they were just a single mass of humanity with many arms and many heads. At his side the unicorn snorted and buckled its head. "Who are you and who do you stand for?" the chief, a man with flowing red locks and gaunt, cruel face, demanded. The sword in his hand was of more interest than him. The blade was made of grey smoke, flowing with the wind but always holding its shape. "I am Kobachan, and I stand for the Maker," he answered, calm as stone. "Ah, religious sentiment, a slave!" the chief called. "Slave!" the entire warband jeered. With a sudden flash of movement, Kobachan lunged forward, his blade-tipped fingers ripping open the throat of the chieftain's horse. As the steed and the rider toppled, the Arachne stepped forward, seizing the man by the collar, and seizing the man's wrists as well, when the bandit made a clumsy sweep to cut Kobachan's head from his shoulders with the smoke blade. The edge of the strange ethereal sword came to a stop inches from Kobachan's neck. The world felt suddenly grey, as if everything that mattered and every emotion that was being drained away, leaving only a pallid shell of what had been before, smoke and ash. Kobachan squeezed his fingers down lightly, blood running from the man's wrist, and pushed towards the sword away. Dozens of blades and spears were aimed at his back, the whole warband frozen as he seized their leader, ready to strike if he killed his hostage. But the chieftain himself simply shouted in defiance, spittle flying from his mouth. "Go ahead, coward! A free man is not afraid!" Slowly, Kobachan squeezed down harder, until the blade dropped from the man's hand and landed in the grass, causing it to wither and dye the stubs of charred black in the moments. The man's wrist hung at an unnatural angle, cut into brutally by Kobachan's razor-sharp touch. "I have no fight with you. I stand for my Maker, the dungeon, who called my soul from the void and shaped my flesh from a humbler spider. I am a visitor here, only observing." Even now, Kobachan's unflinching demeanor held strong. "The dungeon!" The red-headed man paused and let out a barking, sudden laugh. "Let me up then, because we're brothers. We're born from a dungeon too." "You are human," Kobachan replied, "and our first life, sure enough. But now we're so much more. We are remade, my brothers, remade by a dungeon of ash. Let me up, and you can lead me to your Maker." He grinned, and Kobachan saw the sheer madness in his eyes, a single spark of fanaticism burning in an absolute emptiness where sanity and morals should be. "And why would I take you there?" Kobachan asked, but he loosened his grip on the man's throat. It was best for everyone in the situation moved into a calmer direction. "Because we're allies. We've come to free Coltern from the Empire's grip, to make it a free city." The chieftain's insistence that they were friends, brother-in-arms, allies, all of it made Kobachan trust him even less. This man was a Zediot. Kobachan wanted none of it. "And if I say that we're not allies, let me up now," the man said honestly, a dangerously hard tone entering his voice, "and I'll explain everything." With weapons pointed at him from all directions, Kobachan had a little choice. He let go, and the red-haired chieftain rolled onto his feet, walking towards the man Kobachan had beheaded. The corpse was crumbling into ash, the fire flickering beneath his chest. The chieftain reached down, his fingertips piercing through the ashen flesh, causing it to crumble inwards, collapsing as he pulled out a stone that glowed with a flickering, angry orange hue. He died a good death. "It would be a shame if more died," Kobachan said. All around him were men with weapons, but there were few enough places on his body that those weapons could actually harm him. 10 or a dozen of them would die before he would crush under their ranks. "Would it?" "You'll find that we hardly care. We're men of smoke and ash. Us remade. We care only for battle." The man didn't seem to think much of his own wound. His good right hand hanging limp as loosed at his sides with ribbons of blood threading its way down his knuckles. "And we fight against the gods, against the Empire, against anything that seeks to control us." Kobachan was silent. The Maker was with him now, occupying his mind, peering through his eyes. These intruders were dangerous. The sheer fact that they claimed to be from another dungeon was worth his maker's notice. Freedom is the only thing smoke wants for. Hatred is all that ash has left. The chieftain opined. Do you understand now? He turned back to Kobachan, their mad intensity alive in his eyes. No, I don't. Kobachan refused to engage with the madness. Is that a dungeon shard? This is an ember, a bit of life for the dead men to cling to. Here, you'll understand soon. He turned to his men. Bring the prisoners in. One by one the townsfolk of the burned village were lined up, forced to kneel, and the man lifted his sword of smoke from the ground and walked amongst them, stepping behind each of them in turn and swinging his strange blade through their necks. Most of them toppled over dead on the spot. The blade never cut them, never spilled blood. It passed through the flesh like a ghost. They simply died, but others took on a ghostly cut and simply sprawled forward, writhing on the ground, their eyes blank and clouded as they thrashed. By the time the chieftain had come to the end of the line, the first of four were standing up again. The bandits came forward to free them from their bonds, clapping them on the shoulders, greeting them as brothers. The dead men only blinked their lifeless eyes. See, the ashen blade takes away our old life, and the ember. He stepped back and cast the glowing stone amongst the crowd of dead men. Instantly, they went berserk, clawing at each other's faces, fighting to be the one to seize it. 2 were dead, their throats torn out, by the time the girl, not much more than 13, managed to slip through and force the stone down her mouth. The light vanished down her throat. A circlet of white fire briefly formed around her head, before fading. Bandits shoved the rest of the way, wiping at them with the hafts of the axes and the pommels of swords. They clad their new comrade in a cloak of yellow, and gave her an old sword chipped and flaked with rust, and passed her numerous flasks, chanting as she drank a deep from each. Her eyes had a fire now, their fanatic smouldering energy. She grinned a mad woman's grin as her comrades embraced her. It makes us live again, remade. Swords were lifted into the sky, and the cheer rang up. Remade! For all their scoffing at religious sentiment, it was as zealous a moment as any. Kobachan moved to step back, to leave, but the chieftain advanced and chewed. Nah, you don't get to go nowhere, not until you tell us about your maker, my brother. I do not think that I will. Well, that's the thing. You won't have to. Once we remake you, the new you will. The chieftain smiled, a gloriously mad smile. That was when the unicorn let out a whinny and came charging in from behind. His flaming eyes went wide as the beast's horn pushed through his chest, the white horn stained red with gore, his skin turning pale like ash. And then everything turned into a wild, deadly motion. End of chapter. Chapter 1.51 Forced March. I sensed it in the air. An incursion was coming. I knew it as soon as the scouting team on the edge of the ravine drew back, packing up the camp and vanishing down the tunnels. My rafts followed them as they hauled their way up, out of the sewers and into the dingy little tavern where they handed over the maps to the team of 4. No, 5. The last member sat in the corner of the tavern playing a violin. A woman with sapphire eyes that took the map and unrolled it, smiling. She passed it off with a young man with a hideous wriggling mass of scars on his arm. Coin was exchanged across the table. And that was all for an hour. For 2, I waited in tension, checking over my minutiae of my dungeon, rousing the creatures from their dens with a wave of caution and alertness. The whole of my territory swam in a sea of wary paranoia. Then, on the eastern shore, things began to move. Men in shining armor stormed through on horses, shouting and pointing. The masses of common folk huddled at the edge of my lake. They took to the ships that they'd been building for the last few weeks. The rough-hewn shafts and slim canoes, strapping on what cheap weapons they owned and dipping their oars into the water. It was a mass rush for the orchards. It was a distraction. They came in droves, the prows of their ships cutting holes in the thick layer of florid water lilies I had woven over the lake, a blanket of pink that lay over the swaying waters, rising and falling with the waves. I watched as the harpoon spiders crawled up from their dens, beautifully horrible creatures. Their carapace was rough, bruised red, and with numerous small spikes decorating their broad legs. With the hiss of their mandibles snapped open, and they spat out long barbs of bone, going through the air and trading silk lines. Men died in that first volley, their impaled bodies ripped from the ships and dragged through the waters. The lucky ones died from the shock of finding the spear of bone thrust through their guts, rather than suffering the pain and confusion of being reeled in like a fish thrashing on a hook. Struggling, limbs spread on the pink froth and blood and water across the surface of the lake. Boats began to tilt and overturn as real fish smashed their battering ram skulls into the undersides, setting the little vessels lurching in the water. The huge swarm of bright bronze-scaled bodies beneath the shallow green waters congregated on anyone who fell overboard, dragging them down to a silent death. Blood and froths of air bubbles surfaced, rocking the waters. Still, they came, and men in armor and set up along the shore and lifted their bows, turning any ship that tried to change course and retreat into a pincushion. Arrow after arrow pierced the retreaters, urging the rest forward. It was a death march. I could have licked my lips. The small souls of the creatures wandering into my dungeon had long since ceased to count towards my advancement. To keep me moving forward, I needed human lives, or in this case, have them served to me on a silver platter. But something concerned me, dragged my attention away from the slaughter, from Kobachon fighting his own battles. My little ratty spies had lost sight of the adventuring party. They were nowhere to be found, and this was a distraction. It had to be. Nobody would use the lives and bodies of the common folk like fodder like this if they seriously intended a successful mission. Not unless there was a real assault coming from another front. I watched and waited, but nothing. The boats had reached the shore of the mangrove orchard now, and people were rushing ashore, swinging their axes and crude blades mounted on long poles. The fishermen's spiders were overwhelmed, pressed back. Bow and harpoons continued to fly from within their numbers, claiming lives. But even the sight of their comrades being hauled up like broken dolls into the swarming limbs of the arachnid host did nothing to hold back the human tide. Men fell screaming, shaking, foam frothing from their mouths as the little jeweled spiders sank in their teeth. Boa constrictors silently dropped their tails from the branches, cording around their throats and squeezing with the strength to crush bone. It was chaos. It was carnage. They cut the webs ahead of them with a pole arm and fought tooth and nail to keep the spiders scuttling back on the thin, hairy legs. Boots stomped through the shallow water and mud between the mangrove trees. The men climbed and clawed each other down from the branches, all trying to claim the fat golden fruit. It was one of those who hung back, hoping to let the other men clear the way, who met the horror first. Drawn by the blood above, the abyssal shark shifted off its mantle of mud. It rose upward to a tremendous beat of its tail, the sleek bullet racing through the waters. The waters exploded up as it surfaced in a thrash of endless teeth and glimmering pale grey skin. The ship was left broken down and splintering timber, the crew holding on to the shattered spars. A tail and dozens of tendrils coiled through the air as the beast retreated down, down, down. A man clutched half-broken but still living in his jaws. The ones left alive didn't get to breathe. Tendrils coiled around their legs, seizing them by their throats. They hung, corpses from a noose, kicking their limbs as they fought to get free. Making it to the orchard was one thing, making it back to shore from what would depend on their luck. But I couldn't sit and watch them try to make it past the prowling shark. I was still waiting for the axe to fall, for the real invaders to make their entrance through the ravine. Why weren't they here? The thought loomed above me in cold anxiety of storm cloud and omen. I focused my senses on the ravine slopes, thinking back to the maps and seeing the scouts make, the routes that they'd outlined as safe. Something was wrong here. Something was... I paused and began to eat away at the spider web above, cutting loose the moorings so that the sections of silver silk came wafting down, drifting through the air like phantoms. I cut and cut, filling the sky above the canyon with a falling snowdrift of silk. And then a long, tangling thread caught around something that wasn't there. Something invisible. Something moving. They were here. As the adventuring team flickered into view, running fast down the safe route the scouting team had found for them. Thankfully, I'd sabotaged their maps, adding unnecessary detours to the path. Time enough to rouse my minions, I jolted the sloths awake, and all around the 5 adventurers hills of fur and mottled moss lifted up long trailing limbs, huge faces with banded patterns of white, black, and placid, sleepy eyes looked at them. And then the ball swept out with a sudden burst of speed. The bald man with the trio of gemstones orbiting his head lifted his staff. A wall of stone erupted, lifting from the floor of my dungeon, and was shattered by the sloth's might. The stone shrapnel flew at them, but the woman with the violin turned back with a sword note, calling up a wind that shielded them. The sapphire-eyed woman was in the lead, hacking away at the undergrowth of the dense, verdant valley with her sword, cutting them in a route clear of the pitfalls. Dozens of little birds lifted from the giant sloth's back in a storm of cawing. Discordant sound filled the air as they raised their voices in fury. The man with the scarred arm uncorked a wooden canister and hurled it. Smoke, green smoke, puffed out and opened the canister, wafting into the air. The birds fell like stones as a miniature explosion, and burst flame shattered from the canister and expanded its contents into the growing cloud. The sloth yawned, padding forward slowly as the team raced ahead. I had brought the spiders out from their dens, flocking thick across the ravine's far slope. It was only 50 or so feet, but a steep climb. There had been no map made of this portion. The scouts had always retreated out of fear that their escape route would be cut off if they waited too long. Now, the real incursion would have attempted to ascend blind. The bald earth mage thrust both his hands to the group, setting off a minor quake that sent clouds of debris rolling up and down the slope. In only a moment, the actual routes up were exposed, the patches of loose dirt and stone I'd left to go sliding underfoot knocked away. The pitfalls exposed, and the thin layer covering the cracked wall fell inwards. It was a blunt method, but effective. Better yet for them, it caught many of the spiders in a rock slide, pulling their ranks into the disorganized tangle of limbs. The armored woman hit them like an elephant, charging through with sweeping blows from her long bastard sword. Just behind, the alchemist was lighting bottles with rags stuffed down their necks, honing them to explode into a flame and dive the spiders back in fear. The earth mage and violinist moved together, picking off the spiders that got through the vanguard and braved the flames. Last in line was a slim, slender man with a dagger in each hand, fighting off the spiders as they closed in behind the group. They covered the first half of the slope in seconds, but then it all began to turn. A harpoon shot through the air, piercing the earth mage through the shoulder. Only the violinist saved him, catching his leg and some invisible force as the line snapped taut to try and drag him back. In moments, the armored woman was at his side cutting the silk reel, but in doing so she had abandoned her post, clearing the front. The swarm of spiders had finally closed around them, encircling them. From behind, the sloth let out a long, lazy roar as it began to clamber up the slope after them. They were bogged down now, with no route to escape, and the sloth outclassed any of them in sheer, unarguable weight and brute force. The alchemist lit the last bottle and hurled it. The fire struck the sloth against the muddy, mossy back, and couldn't catch a hold of the wet matting of the fur and clinging plant fibers. It wicked out, leaving the beast no worse than singed. The earthen mage, sweating, put his hand on the ground as the sloth sunk in its claws into the rocky side of the slope to climb. The earth underfoot gave way and sent it toppling back with an ungainly roar. Trees were torn into splinters and rolled downhill. Ahead, a harpoon glanced off the woman's armor, winding her. Spiders leapt to grab a hold of their forelegs and dragging her down. The man with the knives lunged forward to cut them, stabbing into the eyes and hacking and reaching limbs. The 3 in the rear were left to fend for themselves as the 2 melee combatants joined together to cut a path forward. The earth mage didn't make it, stumbling, nearly pulling the alchemist down with him, and I watched as the boy made a choice, letting go of his comrade's hand. Fighting, actually having to peel the man's fingers from his own, and dying mage desperately tried to cling on, grasping blindly at his companion. But he couldn't keep hold. The alchemist sprinted after the violinist and the 2 fighters as they charged for the glass door in the gardens. and the Earth Mage was pulled under by the tide of spiders chasing after. The alchemist's face was so pale that you would have thought he died himself. End of chapter. Chapter 1.52 Control. The 4 adventurers stumbled through the door into my inner paradise, the garden of glass bells, panting and huffing with the very breath that they drew, the golden spore that permeated the air into their lungs. Kneeling down the bar lit a stick of incense, and I felt the constricting sense of the restraint surge through my being, seating me out of my ethereal control. The alchemist dressed the small wounds of his comrades with a tin of aromatic balm, the wounds sizzling painfully and seething as he pasted it thick across the bleeding cuts left by my spider's fangs. All the while they were shrinking, they hadn't noticed it yet, but they were losing size with every second. Every delay worked in my favor. "Hold up," the armored woman said, lifting up a gauntleted hand. "Something strange." "Everything's strange." "Strange and beautiful," the alchemist noted, gazing at my domain. The delicate shapes of the glass mushrooms pulsed with a waning and waxing of pale greyish light. A light without any warmth. The landscape was completely alien to the world above, with a pale and sinister reflection. Yeah, but something's wrong. As she had noticed, I had a clever idea of how to slow down the realization in the future, but that would have to wait. She stood, putting her hands flat against her eyeline and tracing it out against the walls. With a dagger from her belt, she scored a line as the near teammates readied themselves. The alchemist unpacked a series of vials and wooden canisters from his bag as the knife fighter cleaned his blades. The violinist watched a comrade through thoughtful eyes. She was dangerous, I felt. It was her abilities that had let them penetrate so far into my domain without notice. After a count of 3 on her steel-clad fingers, the woman again traced the height with her eyeline, her hand touching the wall just below the mark. "We have to move." Her voice was hard. Her companions took notice. "What's going on?" the violinist asked. "I don't know, but it's not good. Come on, in and out before the dungeon knows we're here. That was the plan. We can't slow down now. Here, drink this at least. The golden stuff could be poison." The alchemist was grinding down a handful of herbs, cupping his head over his hand and pestle to keep the spore lazily from drifting from the ceiling and from getting in. He poured out a light silver solution from the vial into the bowl and offered it to his companions. One by one they sipped and winced. "Sorry, no time to make it taste good," he said, wrinkling his nose up and chugging it down. I was counting every second in my favor, and the woman was shifting impatiently on her feet, eyes scanning the fungal forest warily. They could see from the doorway the rise of the glass gazebo and the hilltop that I had built up underneath the silver door of the ever-forest. The way that was complicated by the jungle of the somnolent blooms, high, spiraling stacks of corkscrew-shaped mushrooms that bent crookedly as they reached towards the ceiling, ready to let loose clouds of sleeping poison spores as the slightest touch. Above, the nacre spiders waited, crouched over their false ceilings to slice down on the razor-sharp limbs. The ornamental pools scattered across the floor were deceptively deep, home to lurking real-fish, snakes curled amongst the glass mushrooms. Everything seemed calm and still, but my garden was only waiting to burst forth in a deadly motion. The armored woman took a first step forward, clearly nervous, glancing between the palatial gazebo and the doorway. "Which way?" "I don't know, damn it. Ego was supposed to scout for traps," the knife fighter replied. "I can do something." Lifting her bow, the violinist played a quick sough, drawing out lovely, deep strains from her instrument, a gentle light cascading forth in ribbons to form a small, glowing body of ethereal rabbit, and then another, and another. A cascade of bunnies moved through my gardens, and one by one they died. A snake burst from the undergrowth and sank its fangs into its neck. A pond exploded as a real fish burst above the waters and snagged the kicking poor creature with its tendrils. 2 dropped as they touched the climbing towers of somnolent blooms and were brought down by the explosion of poison that rained down. "Come on, this way." The armored woman led the way, weaving between the blooms as they gave the pond a wary eye, stabbing her sword into the ground before her to flash out the snakes. "Has anyone noticed?" the alchemist started to say, glancing frantically around the gardens. "Yes, And come on, move, she hissed in reply. They were already 2 feet gone from when they had entered, the strangeness of the garden delaying their realization. But they saw it now, saw how they were growing closer and closer to the ground, closer to the small deaded creatures that I propagated through my little wonder of a world, and the spur of fear made them sloppy. A nacre spider dropped, its pearly white armor gleaming from above. The bladed foreleg stabbed through the woman's torso, puncturing her armor like a cheap tin. Another came for her neck, but she deflected it, cleaving the limb away with the sword, even as she was forced to the ground by the creature's weight, slamming her down atop of her. Mandibles that dripped with poison spread wide above her horrified face to deliver the killing bite. The knife fighter tackled the beast from the side, jabbing his blades down into the narrow pinch of the body between the thorax and abdomen. His blades found the unarmored joint and twisted inside, ripping open the beast's most vulnerable point. The man and the spider went roiling into the ground, the woman screaming as the limb that had pierced through the gut was yanked away, tearing the wound open and wide. Her comrades rushed for her, but it was too late. Too late by far. Blood was pouring in waterfalls, straining her armor and filling up the dark earth like a red rain. The violinist laid her hand on the wound and pushed a golden light in, sealing it, but the woman was pale, gasping, and the sword fallen from her hands. The knife fighter ripped his blade free of the dying spider and pushed it off of him, having ended up underneath the upturned back of the tumble, and a lucky happenstance that him and out of the way of its sharp, thin legs thrashing in death throes. But as he rose, poison fangs sunk deep into his thigh. He screamed, stabbing at the snake that curled its muscular body around his leg, hacking away. But it was no good. The shrinking charm over my gardens had reduced him until the serpent could coil all the way up his leg, crushing the bones and bringing him down to the ground. The snake was dying too, hacking nearly in half at the neck. It died a good death defending its home. He would die alone, abandoned by his comrades, far from the sun's light. They were running now. The armored woman lifted with one arm around the alchemist's shoulder as he clutched the wooden canister and ready to throw the first thing that moved. I casually reached out and touched the minds of the nacre spiders, pushing them with angry, bloody thoughts. On cue, they opened up the hidden doors and descended. Gleaming bodies dripped from the ceiling, touching down with deadly limbs. The adventurers were caught out. The way back closed behind a wall of deadly 8-legged bodies. I watched them, no more in control of their lives than the frightened rabbits they sent to die, frozen, in panic, stumbling to a halt. There had been a moment where they'd almost won, where their plan had almost worked. Now their momentum was ebbing away, and they were left to hold of one of the comrades and watch another crawl across the ground, his leg mangled, poisoned, and with every heartbeat he pleaded for them to help. It was so easy to be left helpless, watching your fate rush towards you. The only thing that you could do was come to your senses and make a decision. However terrible, the violinist was stricken. Fear in her eyes, she was sharp but brittle. In situations like this, she would simply freeze. "The door!" the alchemist said, his voice strained. "We have to." He lifted a canister and hurled it where the spiders were thickest between them and the gate to the ever forest. It cracked open and spilled smoke expanding outwards. The spiders scuttled back, my will pulsing through the danger and retreat of fear of poison. But it was only smoke, a distraction in which to break through. They ran, holding the woman underneath the arm as they plunged into the thick smog. Their only hope was now the door, although they couldn't know what was beyond. My lion golem finally roused from its post guarding the doorway, lifted, and lunged into the fog after fleeing shadows. As the smoke cleared, it was left holding a rabbit beneath its paws, and the adventurers were gone. I sighed. The lion really was more concerned with its supper than anything else. It didn't even need to eat. Gone, vanished into the Everforest. Despite the threat it presented, I had time to scout the land beyond the portal. Now one more enemy lurked through that door, waiting for revenge. But today I reaped the full harvest. Dozens had died during the rush towards the orchard, and I had claimed 2 of the world would-be adventurer. I turned my attention back to the grove, watching the poor fools who'd been used as fodder trying to escape back across the waters. My shark rose, its grey shape visible for a moment before the waters burst up in its wake. The rows and rows of teeth were gaping, circular, mouth flashing open as it claimed another life. Broken bits of crude ship drifted on the waters. End of chapter. And that concludes this patch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.